The very air inside Thorn Manor seemed to breathe with hushed secrets, each opulent room a gilded cage for something unspoken. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that dared penetrate the ancient stained glass, illuminating not warmth, but a profound, almost sacred stillness. Lena Petrova felt it the moment the heavy oak doors closed behind her, the silence pressing down, like a physical weight, far heavier than the suffocating weight of expectation that settled upon her shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, ancient leather, and something else indefinable, a faint, metallic tang that spoke of age and perhaps of disuse. Sunlight, muted by heavy velvet drapes and the grime of centuries on the upper panes of the tall windows, struggled to pierce the gloom, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to lengthen and deepen with every soft footfall Lena took. This was Thorn Manor, a monument not just to wealth, but to a fierce, almost defiant isolation. Every vast, echoing hall, every marble-floored corridor, every cavernous room whispered of a power so absolute it had chosen to sever itself from the world, to exist in its own self-contained, gilded reality. It was a place designed to impress, certainly, but more so to intimidate, to remind anyone who entered that they were guests in someone else's impenetrable domain, and their presence was tolerated only under the strictest of unspoken rules. Mrs. Albright, a woman whose every movement was as stiff and precise as the starch collar of her uniform, stood before Lena, her gaze a cold, assessing thing that seemed to strip away layers of pretense, searching for weakness. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her lips were a thin, unsmiling line. She was the mansion's keeper, its sentinel, and the very embodiment of its rigid, unyielding order. She didn't speak in introductions or pleasantries, but in clipped commands, her voice low and even, yet carrying an undeniable authority that resonated in the silent space between them. Lena swallowed, the unspoken weight of the warning settling heavily in her chest. "Yes, Mrs. Albright, I understand." As Mrs. Albright turned, leading Lena down another impossibly long corridor, Lena couldn't help but notice the way the old woman's back was ramrod straight, her posture a testament to years of servitude in this silent, unforgiving house. Lena's own shoulders felt heavy, already burdened by the unspoken rules and the oppressive atmosphere. Her small room, tucked away in the staff wing, was sparse and functional, a stark contrast to the opulence she'd glimpsed in the main areas of the manor. A single bed, a small dresser, a narrow window looking out onto a neglected stretch of garden. It was a cage, albeit a clean one, carefully designed to remind the staff of their place. She quickly changed into the stiff, gray uniform, the fabric feeling coarse against her skin, a uniform that seemed to erase her identity, turning her into just another cog in the silent machinery of Thorn Manor. Her first hours were a blur of polished surfaces and hushed movements. The main gallery was a cavernous space filled with oil portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her as she meticulously wiped away invisible dust. The silence was punctuated only by the soft brush of her cloth and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the manor's ancient infrastructure. It was during one of these tasks, as she was carefully polishing the frame of a particularly grim-looking patriarch, that she heard it. A low murmur of a voice, Elias Thorne's voice, from what sounded like a study nearby. It was a powerful voice, not loud, but deep and resonant, carrying an undeniable authority even in its hushed tones. He was on the phone, the words indistinct at first, then a fragment piercing the thick silence, clear and sharp. No matter the cost. Elias Thorne's voice echoed faintly through the heavy, closed door, a chilling pronouncement that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the house. Lena froze, her hand still on the gilded frame, her breath catching in her throat. She shouldn't be listening. Mrs. Albright's warning about discretion rang in her ears, a harsh, internal reprimand. But she couldn't move. The sheer power in his voice, the quiet intensity, held her captive. Garanta que ela permaneça segura e isolada. Ninguém deve perturbá-la. Ensure she remains safe and isolated. No, one must disturb her. The words hung in the air, a cold, possessive command. Lena's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was talking about someone he wanted isolated, protected at any cost. The identity of this mysterious she instantly became the central, unspoken question of Thorn Manor. It wasn't hard to guess. There was only one other Thorn in this vast, silent house, a presence felt more than seen. Aurora. Lena continued her dusting, her movements now more mechanical, her mind racing. Aurora Thorn, the reclusive daughter. Rumors about her had filtered even into the city, vague whispers of a tragedy, a withdrawal, a silence that had lasted for years. A daughter who hadn't spoken a word in years. Lena had dismissed them as sensational gossip, the kind of stories that clung to the impossibly wealthy. But hearing Elias Thorne's voice, cold and absolute, gave those rumors a terrifying new weight. Later that afternoon, as the slanting light of dusk began to paint the manor's interiors in shades of muted gold and gray, Lena was tasked with refreshing the flowers in the conservatory. It was a vast, glass-domed room, surprisingly lush and vibrant compared to the austere grandeur of the rest of the house, filled with exotic plants and the humid scent of earth and blossoms. As she carefully arranged a bouquet of white lilies, her back to the main entrance of the conservatory, she felt a subtle shift in the air, a faint ripple in the profound silence that usually permeated the manor. It wasn't a sound, not precisely, but a sensation like a shadow falling across a sunlit path. She slowly turned, her heart giving a nervous flutter, and there, standing at the far end of the conservatory, partially obscured by a towering fern, was Aurora Thorne. It was a brief, disorienting glimpse, a tableau frozen in time. Aurora was a wisp of a girl, almost, swallowed by the cavernous room and the wild foliage around her. Her hair, the color of moonlight, hung long and unkempt around a face that was strikingly delicate, almost ethereal. She was dressed in a simple, flowing white gown that seemed to absorb the fading light, making her appear translucent, like a spirit haunting the edges of perception. But it was her eyes that truly held Lena captive. They were large, a startling shade of pale blue, and they stared, not at Lena, but out beyond the glass walls of the conservatory, into the gathering twilight, distant and utterly devoid of expression. There was a profound, aching emptiness in that gaze, a silence so deep it seemed to resonate physically, a void that swallowed all light and warmth. She was looking at nothing, or perhaps at everything Lena couldn't see. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, thin and pale, almost translucent themselves. She seemed utterly still, a living statue, breathing yet detached, present yet entirely absent. The air around her shimmered with an almost palpable aura of profound sorrow and an impenetrable mystery. Lena's breath hitched. She had expected a recluse, perhaps someone fragile or eccentric, but not this. Not this unsettling, almost spectral presence. Aurora was not merely quiet. She was a vessel of silence, a living testament to a grief or trauma so immense it had stolen her voice, and perhaps a part of her soul. Her beauty was undeniable, a delicate, almost tragic beauty, but it was overshadowed by the sheer weight of her unresponsiveness. It was disturbing, yes, deeply unsettling, to witness such a complete lack of engagement with the world. But beneath the unease, a flicker of something else ignited within Lena, a profound, almost magnetic intrigue. What had happened to her? What story lay buried beneath that impenetrable silence? Who was the she Elias Thorn fought so desperately to isolate? Lena felt a strange pull, an inexplicable desire to understand, to pierce the veil of that profound, unsettling stillness. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, Aurora turned, a slow, deliberate movement that was almost robotic in its precision. She drifted away, her white gown seeming to melt into the shadows of the conservatory, disappearing from Lena's sight without a sound. The ripple in the air vanished, and the profound, oppressive silence of Thorn Manor settled back into place, heavier now, imbued with the ghost of Aurora's presence. Lena stood frozen for a long moment, the scent of lilies suddenly cloying, her heart still hammering against her ribs. The brief encounter had left her shaken, yet, strangely, profoundly captivated. The rest of the day passed in a haze of physical exhaustion and mental turmoil. Lena moved through the vast, silent rooms, her hands working on autopilot, her mind replaying the image of Aurora's distant, vacant eyes, Mrs. Albright's clipped instructions, the heavy silence, the endless tasks, all faded into the background, replaced by the ghost of that pale, silent girl. The opulence of the manor, which had initially overwhelmed her, now seemed like a hollow, cold shell, a gilded prison for the broken spirit within. Finally, as darkness fully enveloped Thorn Manor and the last of her duties were completed, Lena retreated to the meager comfort of her own small room. She stripped off the coarse uniform, her muscles aching from the unaccustomed labor, her body heavy with a bone-deep weariness. Lying on the narrow bed, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, the silence of her room, which had initially felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to press in on her, amplifying her thoughts. The image of Aurora, standing amidst the lush green of the conservatory, her eyes fixed on something unseen, refused to leave her mind. It was a look of such profound detachment, such utter desolation, that it had lodged itself deep within Lena's memory, an unsettling echo in the quiet chambers of her own soul. There was a profound sorrow there, yes, but also a fierce, unyielding mystery, a secret held so tightly it had manifested as an unbreakable silence. Lena, a young woman who had always prided herself on her pragmatism, on her ability to see the world as it was, found herself drawn into the enigma of Aurora Thorn. A strange, dangerous attraction began to bloom in her chest, a quiet whisper of curiosity that promised to unravel more than just the secrets of Thorn Manor, but perhaps the very fabric of Lena's own carefully constructed reality. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had stumbled into a world far more complex and perilous than she could have ever imagined, a world where silence was not merely an absence of sound, but a powerful, living force, guarding secrets that pulsed beneath the opulent surface of Elias Thorn's impenetrable domain. And for reasons she couldn't yet articulate, Lena felt an undeniable pull towards that very silence, a magnetic force that promised to either break her or awaken something entirely new within her. The following days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of polished silver, freshly pressed linen, and floors that gleamed with an almost unnatural perfection. Lena, once a whirlwind of vibrant energy and boisterous laughter, found herself moving through Thorn Manor like a ghost, her footsteps hushed, her voice a whisper, her presence as unobtrusive as possible. The mansion itself was a labyrinth of hushed corridors and cavernous rooms, each echoing with a silence so profound it felt like a tangible entity pressing down on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. Every surface was immaculate, every object meticulously placed, a testament to the iron grip of order that permeated every corner of Elias Thorne's domain. It was a beautiful prison, she thought, one built of gilded cages and velvet chains, where even the air felt filtered, scrubbed clean of anything so untidy as emotion. Her days were long, beginning before the first hint of dawn painted the sky and ending only when the last lamp had been extinguished in the servants' quarters. She learned the unspoken rules of the house with a speed born of necessity. Never disturb Mr. Thorne before he called for his morning coffee. Never make eye contact with the older, long-serving staff unless addressed directly. And, above all, never, under any circumstances, approach or speak to Miss Aurora. The other maids, a collection of women as tight-lipped and wary as the mansion itself, offered only clipped instructions and evasive glances when Lena dared to ask about the reclusive heiress. Their eyes, when they occasionally met hers, held a mixture of pity and warning, a silent plea for her to simply do her job and remain invisible. They were shadows, moving through shadows, and Lena began to understand that in this house, visibility meant vulnerability. She pieced together fragments of Aurora's story from hushed whispers in the laundry room, from truncated phone calls overheard from the kitchen, from the way a gardener once sighed heavily. We mentioned the accident. The details were vague, contradictory, and shrouded in a fog of fear and conjecture. Some claimed Aurora had suffered a terrible fall as a child, rendering her mute. Others hinted at a more profound, emotional trauma, a shock so deep it had stolen her voice and locked it away. There were whispers of a beloved pet, lost in a tragic incident, or a nanny who had vanished without a trace. Each snippet of information only deepened the mystery, painting a portrait of a life irrevocably altered, but never offering the full, terrible picture. It was like trying to assemble a mosaic from broken shards, each piece hinting at a larger image, yet none quite fitting together. Lena found herself growing increasingly frustrated, not just with the lack of solid answers, but with the palpable fear that seemed to cling to the very mention of Aurora's name. It was a fear that suggested not just tragedy, but something darker, something deliberately hidden. Despite the warnings, despite the veiled threats in the eyes of the other staff, Lena found herself drawn to Aurora with an almost irresistible pull. She would catch glimpses of her fleeting moments that felt less like chance encounters and more like preordained events. Once, while polishing the ornate banister on the grand staircase, Lena saw Aurora descend, not with the languid grace one might expect of a privileged heiress, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible hesitation. Her hand, slender and pale, trailed along the cold marble, a ghost of a touch. Her eyes, those same unsettling pools of deep, bruised violet, were fixed on some distant point, oblivious to Lena's presence. Lena noticed the way the light caught the fine, almost silvery strands of hair near her temples and the faint tremor in her wrist, a silent testament to a fragility that went beyond mere delicacy. It was a quiet, contained energy like a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Another time, Lena was dusting the vast collection of antique books in the library, a room heavy with the scent of aged paper and leather, when Aurora entered. She moved with an ethereal grace, a silent ripple in the stagnant air, her long, dark dress a stark contrast against the rows of colorful spines. Aurora paused before a particular shelf, her fingers hovering over a worn copy of a forgotten poetry collection. Her brow, usually smooth and unblemished, furrowed almost imperceptibly a fleeting expression of something akin to longing or perhaps recognition. Lena, hidden mostly by a towering bookcase, held her breath, watching. Aurora didn't take the book. She simply stood there for a long moment, her eyes tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine, before turning and drifting out of the room as silently as she had arrived. It was in these stolen moments, these almost accidental observations, that Lena began to see beyond the myth, beyond the whispers, beyond the delicate soul everyone else described. There was a fierce intelligence in those eyes, a deep well of unspoken thought, a silent language that Lena felt an insistent urge to decipher. There was something more in her eyes, something others didn't see or didn't want to see. The culmination of these early days came in a terse, unyielding conversation with Mrs. Albright, the head housekeeper, a woman whose stern demeanor was matched only by the sharpness of her perfectly ironed uniform, summoned Lena to her small, meticulously organized office. The room was sparse, functional, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper, a stark contrast to the opulence. Outside its door, Mrs. Albright sat ramrod straight behind her desk, her hands clasped, her gaze unwavering as Lena stood before her. The air in the room was thick with unspoken authority, with the weight of years of service and absolute control. "Lena," Mrs. Albright began, her voice devoid of warmth, each syllable carefully articulated. "I have observed your diligence. Your work is satisfactory." A brief pause, heavy with unspoken implication. "However, I must reiterate a crucial directive regarding Miss Aurora." Lena felt a prickle of unease, a tightening in her chest. She knew this was coming. "Yes, Mrs. Albright," she managed, trying to keep her voice level, her expression neutral. "The young lady requires a very specific environment," Mrs. Albright continued, her eyes like chips. "A flint, a quiet one, an undisturbed one. Her peace is paramount in this household. Mr. Thorne ensures it, and we, as his staff, are tasked with maintaining it." Her gaze sharpened, boring into Lena. "De senhorita Aurora é uma alma delicada. Ela precisa de paz, não de curiosidade. Entendo." The Portuguese words, though polite, carried the force of an unyielding command. A cold, hard warning that left no room for misinterpretation. Lena nodded, a single, firm dip of her head. "Yes, Mrs. Albright, I understand." But even as the words left her lips, a spark of defiance ignited deep within her. The housekeeper's words, intended to quell her curiosity, only fueled it, turning it into a slow, burning ember. Mrs. Albright leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone, though her face remained impassive. "She's not to be approached, not to be spoken to, not to be engaged with in any way beyond the absolute necessities of your duties. Her routine is precise, her needs are handled by specific personnel. You are not among them." There was a subtle emphasis on the last words, a clear demarcation of Lena's place in the mansion's intricate hierarchy, far below the inner sanctum of Aurora's world. Any deviation from these instructions will be met with immediate and severe consequences. "Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Mrs. Albright," Lena replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, which she carefully kept hidden behind her back. She felt the weight of the mansion's expectations, the silent pressure of its history, and the chilling authority of its mistress. But beneath it all, a quiet rebellion was stirring. The warning, rather than deterring her, had only intensified her resolve. It was as if Mrs. Albright had inadvertently drawn a map to the very thing Lena was forbidden to touch. The encounter left Lena with a sense of profound frustration, a feeling of being caged, yet, simultaneously, a strange determination. The more they tried to cordon off Aurora, the more Lena felt an insistent pull towards her. She spent her nights restless, replaying the fleeting glimpses, the unanswered questions, the vague, contradictory stories. She remembered the way Aurora's hand had hovered over the poetry book, the subtle, almost invisible ripple of emotion on her face. It was a fragile connection, a silent plea that only Lena seemed to hear. And so, ignoring the stark warnings, dismissing the cold command of Mrs. Albright, Lena began to leave small, almost invisible tokens. She would slip a single, perfectly formed white rose plucked from a conservatory onto Aurora's bedside table, tucked discreetly between the pages of a discarded magazine. Another day, she left a small, leather-bound sketchbook, its pages blank and inviting, next to a crystal vase. A week later, a book of abstract art, its vibrant cover a stark contrast to the muted tones of Aurora's room, found its way onto a window seat. Each time, her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was playing a dangerous game, a quiet act of defiance in a house that demanded absolute conformity. She never saw Aurora receive them, never saw a direct reaction. But each morning, when she entered to tidy the room, the rose was gone, the sketchbook had been moved, the art book now rested on a different surface, perhaps even open to a new page. It was a silent acknowledgement, a ghost of a response, a faint whisper in the echoing silence of Thorn Manor, and it was enough. For now, the faint whisper had become a quiet hum in Lena's mind, a constant, gentle thrum of possibility. Each morning, finding a subtle shift in the arrangement of the small tokens, she left for Aurora. A delicate thread of hope tightened around her heart. The white rose, once nestled between magazine pages, reappeared on the nightstand, its petals now slightly unfurled, as if it had been held, warmed, examined. The leather-bound sketchbook, initially placed facing the wall, now lay open on Aurora's desk, its pristine pages a silent invitation, though no marks stained their surface. And the art book, with its bold, defiant strokes of color, had moved from the window seat to the small, ornate table beside the armchair where Aurora often sat, its spine slightly cracked, suggesting it had been opened, perhaps even lingered over. Lena felt a surge of quiet triumph each time. Aurora noticed. It wasn't direct acknowledgement, not a spoken word, but it was a response, a language without sound that only Lena, with her heightened senses and desperate yearning for connection, seemed capable of understanding. I'm sure she noticed. Lena would whisper to herself the words a silent prayer, a confirmation of her own sanity in this house of hushed secrets and unspoken rules. Her determination, initially a fragile spark, now burned with a steady, unwavering flame. Every shift became a meticulous study, an almost obsessive observation of Aurora's world. Lena began to see patterns where others saw only stillness, subtle anomalies that spoke volumes. The way Aurora's gaze, usually distant, would occasionally snag on a particular painting on the wall, holding, for a fraction of a second longer than usual when Lena was in the room. The almost imperceptible tensing of her shoulders when Mrs. Albright's sharp voice echoed down the hall, or the way her fingers, delicate and pale, would drum a silent, nervous rhythm against the armrest of her chair. When she thought no one was watching, Lena learned the precise angle of Aurora's head when she was lost in thought, the barely discernible shift in her posture when a piece of music played, a fleeting moment where her body seemed to soften, to respond to the melody before snapping back into its rigid composure. It was a secret world, unfolding in minute detail before Lena's eyes, a tapestry woven from silence and shadow, and Lena, by some strange twist of fate, had been granted a glimpse behind the veil. She watched Aurora's routine with the intensity of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. The exact time Aurora would descend for her breakfast, the specific chair she would gravitate towards, the precise order in which she would drink her tea and touch the rim of her plate. Lena noted the subtle variations. A day when Aurora might pause by the conservatory doors, her eyes lingering on the riot of green and color within, or an afternoon when she would sit by the piano, her hands resting, not playing, but simply resting on the keys, a ghost of a melody haunting her fingertips. These were not Random acts. Lena knew they couldn't be. They were tiny deviations from a meticulously constructed schedule, faint echoes of a life once lived, whispers of a personality suppressed. Each observation felt like finding a small, precious clue, a fragment of a larger puzzle she was desperate to solve. The air in Thorn Manor, typically thick with a quiet, almost suffocating stillness, shifted dramatically one Tuesday afternoon. A low rumble from the gravel driveway heralded the arrival of a sleek, black limousine, its polished surface reflecting the gloomy sky like a shard of obsidian. A collective hush fell over the staff. Mrs. Albright, usually a fortress of composure, straightened her already impeccable uniform, her lips thinning into a taut line. Even the usually unflappable Mr. Davies, the stern butler, seemed to hold his breath. Lena, dusting an antique console in the main hall, felt an immediate, inexplicable dread prickle her skin. This wasn't a casual visitor. This was a force of nature. The limousine door opened, and a man emerged, tall and imposing, his presence filling the grand entrance with an almost physical weight. Elias Thorne, Aurora's father. He was a figure carved from granite, his suit perfectly tailored, his silver hair swept back from a sharp, intelligent face. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the hall with an unnerving intensity, missing nothing, acknowledging no one. Lena instinctively shrank back, feeling the oppressive power radiating from him. He moved with an economical grace that belied his formidable stature, each step deliberate, resonating through the silent house. Aurora was in the drawing room, seated by the large bay window, her back to the door, seemingly lost in the contemplation of the rain-streaked garden. Elias Thorne entered without a sound, a phantom of authority. Lena, still in the hall, could only glimpse the scene, but the atmosphere within the room instantly congealed, becoming heavy, suffocating. She saw Aurora's already rigid posture stiffen further, her shoulders drawing inwards, almost imperceptibly, as if trying to shrink away, to disappear. It was a visceral reaction, raw and immediate, a silent scream of aversion. Elias walked directly to a high-backed armchair opposite Aurora, settling into it with the air of a monarch taking his throne. He did not speak to her, did not acknowledge her directly at first. Instead, his cold gaze swept around the room, assessing, judging. Lena felt a chill seep into her bones, a stark contrast to the cautious hope that had been blooming within her. This was the source of the silence, the architect of Aurora's prison. She could feel it, an invisible web of control and expectation woven by this man, trapping his daughter in a life devoid of sound or expression. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Mrs. Albright, he called, his tone devoid of warmth. Come in. Mrs. Albright, who had been hovering just outside the drawing room, her face a mask of practiced deference, glided in. Yes, Mr. Thorne, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Any incidents with Aurora? Elias asked, his gaze fixed not on his daughter, but on the housekeeper, as if Aurora herself were an object of clinical study, rather than a person. Any change in routine? His questions were precise, cutting, designed to elicit facts, not feelings. Lena watched Aurora from her vantage point, her heart aching. Aurora remained motionless, a statue of despair. Her head slightly bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Albright cleared her throat. No, Mr. Thorne. All remains as it should be. Miss Aurora is adhering to her schedule with perfect consistency. There have been no irregularities. Her words were a chilling confirmation of the mansion's oppressive order, a testament to the suffocating control that dictated Aurora's existence. Lena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The small, hopeful signs she had been finding, the subtle shifts and movements, were clearly invisible or perhaps intentionally ignored by those closest to Aurora. They saw only the expected, the desired. They saw only silence. Elias Thorne nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement of his head. Good, he said the word a pronouncement rather than an expression of satisfaction. Maintain the current equilibrium. He did. Not look at Aurora, not even once. His visit was purely an inspection, a check on his most valuable and most fragile possession. He stood up as abruptly as he had sat down, his presence receding, yet leaving an indelible mark, a residue of cold authority that lingered in the air long after the limousine had purred away down the driveway. The tension in the house slowly began to dissipate, but the memory of his visit and the palpable fear it had evoked in Aurora remained. Lena spent the rest of the day in a haze of quiet despair, the brief glimpse of Elias Thorne, solidifying her understanding of Aurora's predicament. The silent daughter was not just a medical mystery. She was a symptom, a consequence of a life lived under the shadow of a man who valued control over compassion, order over emotion. Lena's subtle attempts at connection suddenly felt small, insignificant against such an imposing force. How could a single white rose, a forgotten sketchbook, hope to penetrate such a fortress of despair? That evening, as the last sliver of twilight bled from the sky, Lena returned to Aurora's room for the final turn-down service. The air still felt heavy, charged with the lingering presence of Elias Thorne. Aurora was already in bed, lying perfectly still, her eyes closed, though Lena suspected she wasn't truly asleep. On the small bedside table, where Lena had left a delicate silver thimble she had found in an old sewing box earlier that day, a small, unassuming gift, a symbol of meticulous craft. Something had changed. The thimble was no longer resting on its side. It stood upright, perfectly, balanced on its narrow rim, a feat that would have required careful, deliberate placement. And, nestled within its tiny opening, almost invisible unless one knew to look, was a single, impossibly small, dried petal from a white rose. Lena's breath hitched. Her heart, which had been heavy with despair moments before, now throbbed with a fierce, renewed hope. She noticed. Aurora had noticed. More than noticed, she had responded. Not just moved an object, but transformed it, imbued it with a silent message, a fragile, defiant gesture that spoke volumes in its quiet artistry. It was a reply, not just to the thimble, but to the rose, to the sketchbook, to the art book. It was a sign, a whisper in the echoing silence of Thorne Manor, a ghost of a response, but this time it was clear, intentional, and unmistakably for Lena. This wasn't just acknowledgement. This was communication. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was an invitation. And Lena knew, with a certainty that vibrated through every fiber of her being, that she had to go beyond subtle tokens. She had to find a way to truly speak to Aurora, to break through the years of silence, to tear down the walls that Elias Thorne had built. Lena knew, with a certainty that vibrated through every fiber of her being, that she had to go beyond subtle tokens. She had to find a way to truly speak to Aurora, to break through the years of silence, to tear down the walls that Elias Thorne had built. The small, impossibly balanced thimble with its single dried rose petal was not just a sign. It was a desperate plea for connection, a fragile bridge, reaching across a chasm of unspoken words. And Lena, fueled by a surge of audacious hope, decided she would meet that plea with an answer that was equally bold, though still, for now, silent. The next morning, Lena made her way to Aurora's suite with a renewed sense of purpose, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. She carried a feather duster and a soft cloth, the pretense of her duties, a flimsy veil over her true intent. Mrs. Albright, ever watchful, gave her a curt nod as she passed, her eyes sharp and assessing. Lena met her gaze with a carefully constructed neutrality, her heart thrumming against her ribs. She pushed open the heavy oak door to Aurora's room, the soft thud echoing in the vast silence. Aurora was there, as Lena had hoped. She sat by the window, a sliver of pale morning light, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing around her. Her back was to the door, her posture rigid, a familiar silhouette against the muted landscape outside. Lena swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. This was it. No more subtle hints, no more leaving clandestine objects. This was direct. This was risky. She began to move around the room, making a show of dusting the ornate furniture, her movements slow and deliberate, each brush of the duster a soft whisper in the quiet. She avoided looking directly at Aurora at first, allowing her presence to settle, to be accepted as a part of the daily routine. The scent of old wood and faint rose lingered in the air, a melancholic perfume. Lena's gaze drifted across the room, taking in the carefully arranged books, the antique trinkets, the unsettling perfection of a life meticulously preserved in stasis. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of strategies and anxieties. Her silence is not empty, Lena thought, the words echoing in the vast chamber of her skull. It's a fortress, but fortresses can be penetrated. She knew she couldn't rush any sudden movement, any perceived threat, and Aurora would retreat deeper into herself, perhaps irrevocably. Slowly, carefully, Lena edged closer to Aurora's side of the room. She began to dust the tall, intricately carved bookshelf that stood beside the window, within Aurora's peripheral vision. The shelves were filled with leather-bound volumes, some ancient, some seemingly untouched, their spines faded by time. Mixed among them were small, curious objects, a polished stone, a miniature silver locket, a dried flower press between glass. Each item seemed to hold a story, a fragment of a life now frozen in time. As Lena worked, she stole glances at Aurora, trying to gauge her reaction. There was nothing, no flicker, no shift in posture, just the same unyielding stillness. But then something began to change, imperceptibly at first, like the slow turning of tide. Lena noticed a slight tension in Aurora's shoulders, a subtle rigidity that hadn't been there moments before. Her head, still facing the window, seemed to tilt just a fraction, as if her hearing had sharpened. Lena continued her work, her heart now hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached for a particularly old, heavy book, its cover adorned with a faded gold crest. As her fingers grazed the spine, she saw it. Aurora's reflection in the window pane. The reflection showed Aurora's head turning, slowly, meticulously, until her gaze was fixed squarely on Lena. Her eyes, usually veiled and distant, were now open wide, a depth of scrutiny in them that Lena had never witnessed before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something far more unnerving, far more captivating, an intense, almost analytical curiosity. Aurora was watching her, studying her, dissecting her every movement with an unnerving precision. Lena felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being under a microscope, but also a thrill of recognition. This was it. This was the connection. Aurora was engaged. Lena took a deep, steadying breath, trying to slow her racing pulse. She picked up a small, intricately carved wooden bird from the shelf, its wings spread as if in mid-flight, and pretended to dust it with meticulous care. Her hands, however, were not as steady as she wished. Her fingers, slick with nervous perspiration, fumbled. The wooden bird, a delicate piece of craftsmanship that looked as though it had seen decades of silent observation from its perch, slipped. Time seemed to warp, stretching out the moment into an agonizing eternity. The bird tumbled from Lena's grasp, arcing downwards toward the polished hardwood floor. In that suspended breath, Lena's mind screamed, a silent protest against the impending crash, against the desecration of this fragile, beautiful object against the rupture of the delicate peace she had so painstakingly cultivated. She saw the bird fall, its carved wings seeming to catch the light, a miniature tragedy, unfolding in agonizing slow motion. Her hand instinctively shot out, a desperate, futile grab at empty air. But before her fingers could even register the lack of contact, a blur of motion erupted from beside her. It was Aurora. Aurora, who had been a statue mere seconds before, now moved with a startling, almost feral agility. Her arm, long and slender, whipped out with an unexpected swiftness, a sudden, violent break from her characteristic stillness. Her body, once rigid, now coiled with a latent energy Lena had never suspected. It was a purely reflexive action, an instinct honed by something ancient and primal, a sudden, desperate lunge to intercept the falling object. Aurora's hand, delicate yet surprisingly strong, shot out like a viper, her fingers closing around the wooden bird mere inches from the floor. The impact of the catch was soft, almost soundless, but the sheer force of the movement, the unexpected eruption of vitality from a being Lena had come to think of as almost entirely quiescent, was deafening in its implications. Lena froze, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound awe. The air in the room seemed to crackle with the residual energy of Aurora's sudden, explosive action. For an instant, a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, Aurora held the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths, a visible sign of the exertion, the sudden jolt of life that had surged through her. Slowly, meticulously, her gaze lifted from the rescued object. Her eyes, those deep, fathomless pools that usually held nothing but a distant, unreadable sorrow, now met Lena's. And in that moment, something shifted, something profound. For a second, the icy barrier that enveloped her seemed to crack, revealing a flash of something ancient, something alive. It was an emotion, raw and fleeting, that Lena couldn't quite decipher. A spark of something that defied the years of silence, the carefully constructed facade of detachment. Was it surprise at her own swiftness? Relief that the object was saved? Or was it something else? Entirely a ghost of a memory, a flicker of recognition for the small wooden bird, or perhaps even for Lena herself? It was a connection, undeniable and visceral, a silent scream of life from within. The depths of her quiet prison. There was a vulnerability there, a fleeting crack in the impenetrable wall, a glimpse into the tempest that must rage beneath Aurora's serene exterior. Lena felt a jolt of hope so potent it almost brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't just a reflex. This was a response. This was communication in its purest, most instinctual form. Aurora had seen her, reacted to her, saved something because of her. The moment hung, taut and fragile, between them. Lena felt a profound sense of exhilaration, a fierce, burning triumph. She had broken through. She had seen a glimpse of the real Aurora, a vibrant, living soul buried beneath years of enforced stillness. The sheer vitality of Aurora's movement, the unexpected depth of emotion in her eyes, shattered every preconceived notion Lena had held about her. Aurora was not merely a vessel of silence. She was a complex tapestry of hidden reflexes, dormant memories, and suppressed emotions. But just as quickly as it appeared, the spark in Aurora's eyes receded, swallowed by the familiar veil of detachment. Her grip on the wooden bird loosened, and she extended her hand, offering it back to Lena with a slow, deliberate movement. Her face was once again a mask, unreadable, though Lena could still perceive the lingering tremor in her hand, the faint flush on her pale cheeks. Lena reached out, her fingers brushing Aurora's as she took the bird. The contact was brief, almost electric, a silent acknowledgement of the shared, momentous instant. Before Lena could even formulate a thought, before she could process the implications of what had just transpired, the heavy oak door to the room swung open with a soft creak. Mrs. Albright stood, framed in the doorway, her expression a thundercloud. Her eyes, cold and flinty, swept over Lena, then settled on Aurora, a silent accusation in their depths. The air in the room, which had just moments before been charged with a fragile, nascent connection, now became thick within oppressive tension. Aurora, without a word, without another glance at Lena, rose from her seat by the window. Her movements were slow once more, deliberate, as if the burst of energy had never happened. She glided past Lena, her presence a phantom, and walked toward Mrs. Albright, her back ramrod. Straight, her gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. Mrs. Albright waited, her hands clasped. Tightly in front of her, her face a mask of severe disapproval. As Aurora reached the doorway, Mrs. Albright placed a hand on her back, a possessive, guiding gesture, and ushered her out of the room. The door closed softly behind them, leaving Lena utterly alone in the suddenly cavernous silence. Lena stood in the middle of the room, the small wooden bird still clutched in her hand, its carved wings a poignant reminder of the moment that had just passed. Her heart still thrummed with a mixture of exhilaration and a cold, creeping dread. She had seen something, felt something, reached something within Aurora that no one else seemed to touch. But in doing so, she had undeniably crossed an invisible line, a boundary guarded fiercely by Mrs. Albright, by Elias Thorne, by the very walls of Thorne Manor. The severe look on Mrs. Albright's face, the abruptness of Aurora's departure, left Lena with an undeniable, chilling sensation. She was no longer just a maid. She was a trespasser, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her actions would not go unnoticed, nor would they be easily forgiven. The fortress had been momentarily breached, but the guardians were closing ranks, and Lena was suddenly, acutely aware of the danger she had invited, not just for herself, but perhaps, more terrifyingly, for Aurora. The certainty of that danger did not linger long in the quiet aftermath of Aurora's departure. It was almost immediately confirmed. A sharp rap on the door, not from Mrs. Albright, but from one of the junior housemaids, pulled Lena from her stunned reverie. The young girl, barely older than a teenager, fidgeted nervously, her eyes avoiding Lena's. "Mr. Thorne requests your presence in his study, Miss Petrova." Immediately, the words hung in the air, cold and official, leaving no room for refusal or delay. Lena's stomach clenched, a cold knot tightening beneath her ribs. She looked down at the small wooden bird still cradled in her palm, its smooth, cool surface a stark contrast to the sudden clammy heat of her hand. She wanted to hide it, to make any evidence of her transgression vanish, but there was no time. Swallowing hard, she nodded, placing the bird carefully on a nearby side table, as if setting down something fragile and precious. The walk to Elias Thorne's study was a silent, agonizing journey through the mansion's opulent, yet increasingly foreboding, corridors. Each step on the plush Persian rugs felt muffled, absorbing sound, amplifying the frantic thrum of her own heartbeat. Portraits of solemn, unsmiling ancestors stared down from gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow her, silent sentinels of the Thorne legacy. The air grew heavier, cooler, as she approached the west wing, a part of the house she had only glimpsed from a distance. The study door itself was a formidable slab of dark, polished oak, intricately carved with symbols she couldn't decipher, a heavy brass knocker gleaming dully in the dim light. It looked less like an entryway and more like the portal to a sealed vault. She took a deep, shuddering breath, straightened her uniform, and raised her hand to knock. Before her knuckles could make contact, the door swung inward silently, revealing Mrs. Albright, her face a rigid mask of professional neutrality. She merely gestured for Lena to enter, then closed the door behind her. With a soft click that resonated with an unnerving finality. The study was vast, a cavernous space dominated by dark wood, leather, and the hushed scent of old books and expensive cigars. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, crammed with volumes that looked more like decorative props than actual reading material. A massive mahogany desk, gleaming under the focused beam of a brass lamp, sat in the center of the room, behind which Elias Thorne was already seated. He was a man carved from granite, his suit impeccably tailored, his silver hair neatly combed, his eyes, sharp as obsidian shards, fixed on Lena the moment she stepped across the threshold. There was no warmth in his gaze, no trace of the polite, if distant, employer she had briefly encountered during her interview. This was the billionaire, the titan of industry, a man accustomed to commanding, to being obeyed without question. The air crackled with a cold, almost palpable formality. Lena felt suddenly small, insignificant, like a lone moth caught in the glare of a powerful searchlight. Her palms felt slick, her throat dry. She stood awkwardly just inside the door, unsure if she should approach, if she should speak, if she should simply wait for her inevitable condemnation. Elias Thorne finally broke the silence, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held an edge of steel. Esare Petrova, he began, the name a formal, distant address that underscored the chasm between them. He leaned back slightly in his leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his posture radiating an unshakable authority. I understand you've had a rather eventful first few days. His words were calm, almost conversational, yet Lena felt the weight of them, each syllable carrying an unspoken accusation. He didn't need to specify what eventful meant. The memory of Aurora's sudden laugh, the shared bird, Mrs. Albright's furious gaze, all flashed through Lena's mind like incriminating evidence. I value efficiency, Esare Petrova, and the obedience. My daughter is a delicate subject. Any perturbation can have serious consequences. The phrase delicate subject hung in the air, laced with a warning that was barely veiled. It wasn't just about Aurora's fragility, Lena instinctively knew, but about Elias Thorne's control, his carefully constructed world. Lena swallowed, her voice a little shaky as she tried to defend herself, to explain. I only want to help, Senior Thorne. She seems so alone. The words felt inadequate, naive even in this intimidating room, under the gaze of this powerful man. She knew it sounded like a platitude, an excuse, but it was the truth of her heart. She had seen the profound loneliness in Aurora's eyes, a reflection of something she herself understood too well. But Elias Thorne merely scoffed, a soft, dismissive sound that was barely audible. He didn't shift his gaze, those dark eyes remaining locked on hers, unwavering, dissecting. Her solitude is a protection. Don't forget that. The words were delivered with a chilling finality, a clear indication that he considered the matter closed, her interference unwelcome. It was a stark affirmation that Aurora's isolation was not a misfortune, but a deliberate, calculated choice enforced by him. Lena's breath hitched. Protection from what? Or perhaps, protection for whom? The question burned in her mind, unspoken, yet fiercely present. It felt like a thinly veiled threat, not just for Lena, but for Aurora herself, a promise that any attempt to breach that solitude would be met with severe repercussions. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, letting Lena feel the full force of his authority. Then, with a subtle shift of his posture, he steepled his fingers again, his gaze unwavering. However, he continued, his tone softening imperceptibly, yet losing none of its underlying steel. I recognize talent, Esare Petrova, and I am willing to overlook certain initial missteps provided they do not recur. He pushed a slim, leather-bound folder across the polished surface of his desk. It slid silently, stopping precisely at the edge closest to Lena. Your performance, aside from this incident, has been satisfactory. Mrs. Albright has noted your diligence. Lena stared at the folder, then back at him, a flicker of confusion warring with her apprehension. Was this a reprieve? A test? Elias Thorne then leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost seductive murmur, a stark contrast to his earlier severity. I am prepared to offer you a significant increase in your remuneration, a substantial sum, well beyond what any other maid in this country could hope to earn. He named a figure, a number that made Lena's eyes widen, a sum that would not only erase her debts, but provide a comfortable nest egg, a future she hadn't dared to dream of. It was a life-changing amount, a golden cage. With, of course, he added, his eyes piercing hers, the understanding that your duties will be performed with the utmost discretion, and that you will respect the boundaries that have been established for my daughter's well-being. Her peace is paramount. The condition wasn't spoken directly, but it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Accept the money and stay away from Aurora. Maintain the fragile, silent status quo. Become another cog in the meticulously ordered, emotionless machinery of Thorne Manor. A tremor ran through Lena. The offer was staggering, tantalizing, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But it felt like a bribe, a silencing payment, a transaction that sought to purchase not just her service, but her conscience. The money would buy her freedom from debt, but it would chain her to a silent complicity, forcing her to ignore the plea she had heard in Aurora's eyes, the faint glimmer of connection she had felt. She looked at Elias Thorne, seeing not just a powerful man, but a possessive one, a man who saw his daughter not as a fragile person, but as a prized, delicate possession to be guarded, managed, and controlled. His words about Aurora's fragility and peace now rang hollow, a thinly veiled justification for an emotional imprisonment. It was then, in the suffocating opulence of that study, facing the cold, calculating gaze of Elias Thorne, that a new, fierce resolve solidified within Lena. Intimidation, yes, she felt it acutely. Distrust, absolutely. But also a burgeoning sense of purpose, a burning conviction that Aurora's silence was not a natural condition, but a prison, perhaps one built by Elias Thorne himself, brick by silent brick. She couldn't abandon her now, not after glimpsing the spark of life within her, not after feeling that shared moment of vulnerability. She took another deep breath, forcing herself to meet Elias Thorne's unwavering gaze, her own eyes, now reflecting a newfound steel. The internal conflict raged for only a fleeting moment, the temptation of the money warring with the burgeoning sense of duty, of connection she felt towards Aurora. The money represented security, a clean slate, a chance to escape the endless struggle of her own life. But at what cost? To turn her back on someone who clearly needed her, to become another silent observer in Aurora's gilded cage? It was a price she found herself unwilling to pay, not truly. She understood now that Elias Thorne didn't just want her to stop bothering Aurora. He wanted her to stop seeing Aurora, to stop recognizing the person beneath the imposed silence. He wanted her to become blind, deaf, and mute to the truth, just as Aurora seemed to be. And that, Lena realized, was something she could not do. Not anymore. I understand, Mr. Thorne, Lena said, her voice steadier now, betraying none of the turmoil churning within her. She picked up the folder, feeling the crisp edges of the paper, the weight of the potential future it represented. She could pretend to accept his terms, to play his game. She would take the money, yes, because she needed it desperately. But she would not be bought. She would not be silenced. She would simply become more discreet, more observant, more cunning. I assure you, I will respect all boundaries. She held his gaze, her expression carefully neutral, a mirror of his own controlled composure. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head, a dismissal. Good. Then we understand each other, Sarai Petrova. The conversation was over. Lena turned and walked out of the study, the heavy oak door closing behind her with that same unsettling click. She clutched the folder, the significant increase in her wages, a heavy, almost uncomfortable weight in her hand. The money was a leash, she knew, but she would find a way to lengthen it, to fray it, perhaps even to break it. Walking back through the silent corridors, the mansion felt less like a house and more like a vast, intricate puzzle, a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Her fear had not vanished, but it was now tempered by a fierce, quiet resolve. Elias Thorne's possessiveness, his insistence on Aurora's protection, only solidified Lena's conviction. Aurora's silence was not merely a symptom of an illness, but a meticulously maintained facade, a condition enforced by her father. And Lena, now armed with a financial buffer and a dangerous secret mission, intended to find out why. She would continue her duties with an intensified scrutiny, every dust-covered antique, every forgotten book, every drawer in the mansion now a potential hiding place for a clue. She would watch, she would listen, and she would search. She would find the cracks in the fortress walls, hoping to discover the truth about Aurora's past, about Elias Thorne's secrets, and about the nature of the silence that had swallowed a young woman's voice for years. The game had just begun, and Lena, the unassuming Maid, was now a reluctant, yet determined player. The mansion, once a mere gilded cage, had transformed into a sprawling, silent conspirator in Lena's mind, each echoing hallway a potential witness, every shadowed alcove a repository of secrets. Elias Thorne's words, heavy with implied threats and veiled warnings, had only sharpened her resolve. She moved through her daily chores with an almost imperceptible shift in her demeanor, her eyes now scanning, truly seeing the intricate patterns of the wallpaper, the forgotten corners where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight, the imposing, uninviting doors that led to areas she knew were off-limits. Her designated cleaning routes, once a tedious ritual, became a covert reconnaissance mission. She started with the less frequented wings, the guest rooms that had remained untouched for years, justifying her presence by the need for a thorough spring cleaning. She polished antique furniture, her fingers tracing the cold, smooth wood, while her gaze darted to hidden compartments, to the backs of drawers, to any loose panel or discolored patch on walls. Her first real target, however, was the old library. It was a vast, cavernous space, seldom used, its towering shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound tomes that seemed to hold centuries of quiet wisdom. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, a scent that hinted at long-forgotten stories. Mrs. Albright rarely ventured here, deeming it an unnecessary expenditure of effort when the family preferred modern digital entertainment. This neglect was Lena's opportunity. She dedicated an entire morning to dusting the library, a tedious task that allowed her ample time to explore. Her feather duster moved rhythmically over spines, but her fingers were discreetly testing, pushing, feeling for anything out of place. She imagined Aurora's mother, a woman whose ghost seemed to linger in the mansion's silence, spending hours in this very room, perhaps finding solace among the quiet words. It was behind a particularly dense section on ancient mythology, a row of books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in decades, that Lena found her first tangible lead. Tucked away on a high shelf, almost hidden by a decorative wooden carving, was a small, ornately carved wooden box. It wasn't large, perhaps only 6 inches square, and its surface was intricately inlaid with mother of pearl, depicting a swirling floral design. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp lurch. This was not a dust-covered relic, but something carefully concealed. With a nervous glance over her shoulder, a habit she was quickly developing, Lena carefully lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked, solid and cool to the touch. She found no lock, only a tiny, almost invisible latch on the side. With a gentle click, it sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were two objects. The first was a small stack of photographs, their edges curled with age, printed on thick, glossy paper. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she carefully picked up the top one. It was Aurora, unmistakably, but a younger Aurora, perhaps no older than 5 or 6. Her hair was lighter than, almost golden, and her eyes, wide and sparkling, held a boundless joy that Lena had never witnessed. The child in the photo was laughing, a bright, uninhibited sound Lena could almost hear. She was on a swing, her small legs kicking towards the sky, her face alight with pure, unadulterated happiness. Lena shuffled through the other photos. Aurora with a proud-looking woman, likely her mother, both smiling in a sun-drenched garden. Aurora with a playful puppy, her arms wrapped around its neck. Aurora blowing out candles on a birthday cake, her face smudged with frosting. Each image was a poignant, heartbreaking glimpse into a life utterly different from the silent, haunted existence Aurora now endured. The stark contrast was a punch to Lena's gut, solidifying her conviction that something terrible had indeed ripped that joy away. This wasn't merely a shy girl. This was a girl whose laughter had been stolen. Beside the photos, nestled in the same velvet lining, was a small, silver music box. It was delicate, exquisitely crafted with tiny filigree details that shimmered even in the dim light of the library. Lena recognized the tune immediately from a faint memory of her own childhood, a lullaby, sweet and melancholic. She wound the small key on its side, and a soft, tinkling melody filled the silence of the library, a fragile echo of innocence. The lullaby played out, each note a tear in the oppressive quiet of the mansion, and Lena felt a profound sadness settle over her. This music box, these photos, they were clearly cherished, hidden away as if too precious to be exposed to the harsh realities of the outside world, or perhaps too painful. She carefully placed the photos and music box back in their secret spot, her fingers lingering on the cold metal of the box. But her search wasn't over. The hidden box suggested other hiding places, other secrets. Emboldened by her discovery, Lena turned her attention to the old desk in the corner. A massive mahogany piece with intricate carvings that suggested it belonged to a bygone era. It was precisely the kind of place where someone might tuck away something they didn't want found. The drawers were mostly empty, filled only with yellowed notepads and forgotten pens, but Lena systematically checked each one, her fingers running along the bottom and sides. And then in the very last drawer, beneath a false bottom that required a specific, almost imperceptible push to dislodge, she found it. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn and faded, the pages brittle with age. It didn't look like Aurora's handwriting, too elegant, too mature. It was more likely her mother's, or perhaps an old caregiver's. Lena's hands trembled as she opened it, the faint scent of lavender and old paper wafting up. The entries were sporadic, sometimes dated, sometimes not, written in a careful, looping script. She skimmed the first few pages, mundane observations about daily life in the mansion, notes about Aurora's childhood milestones, descriptions of her vibrant personality. Then, the tone shifted. Abruptly, the handwriting became more frantic, the lines more pressed into the page. Lena's eyes darted across the words, her breath catching with each new, cryptic phrase. The shadow grows longer, one entry read. Another, more chilling, he watches. Always. He knows. And then, a series of entries that made her heart pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. The day approaches. The day everything changes. I fear for her. For us. He won't let her speak. And finally, a scrawled, almost illegible line that sent a shiver down her spine. The hidden truth will destroy them all. If only someone would listen. What happened that day? What were they hiding? Lena's thoughts raced, a whirlwind of questions and terrifying possibilities. The journal didn't explicitly name names, but the context, the references to he and her, the location, all pointed to Elias Thorne and Aurora. It was a diary of dread, a chilling premonition of the tragedy that had clearly befallen this family. Lena felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of triumph and profound apprehension. This was it. This was the key. Lost in her discovery, her mind reeling from the implications of the cryptic entries, Lena barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching the library door. The heavy oak swung open with a soft groan, and Lena froze, the journal still clutched in her hands, her heart leaping into her throat. Mrs. Albright stood framed in the doorway, her silhouette stark against the brighter hallway light, her posture as rigid and unyielding as ever. Her eyes, usually watchful, now held a glint of something sharper, colder. There was no surprise on her face, only a grim, knowing disapproval that made Lena's blood run cold. Lena's mind raced, scrambling for an excuse, a plausible reason for her presence in the forbidden library, let alone with a hidden journal in her grasp. Her breath caught a dry, dusty gasp. She tried to feign a casual demeanor, but her hands were clammy, her face undoubtedly flushed. She slowly lowered the journal, attempting to appear as though she had merely been tidying a misplaced book. Mrs. Albright, Lena managed, her voice a little too high, a little too strained. I saw some dust here on the lower shelves, and I thought a thorough cleaning was in order. This room is so rarely used, you see. Her gaze flickered nervously from the diary to Mrs. Albright's unreadable face. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Mrs. Albright took a slow, deliberate step into the room, her eyes sweeping over the desk, then lingering on Lena's hands. "Indeed," she said, her voice devoid of inflection, yet somehow brimming with menace. "Such diligence. But I believe your designated duties do not extend to the private archives of the family, nor to areas I have explicitly marked as off-limits. There are other staff members whose responsibilities include these deeper cleanings." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift that felt like a direct accusation. "Perhaps you are finding the mansion too large for your memory, Ms. Petrova, or perhaps you simply enjoy exploring where you do not belong." The silence that followed was suffocating, punctuated only by the frantic pounding of Lena's own heart. She felt Mrs. Albright's gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on her, stripping away her flimsy excuses. Lena could feel the warmth of the old leather diary against her palm, a burning secret, a ticking time bomb. She knew she had to get rid of it, to conceal it now. "No, Mrs. Albright, of course not," Lena forced herself to say, trying to inject a note of innocent deference into her tone. "I merely wish to be thorough. I apologize if I overstepped. I will ensure it does not happen again." She slowly, carefully slid the journal behind a stack of books on the desk, hoping the movement was subtle enough to escape Mrs. Albright's scrutiny. She was acutely aware of the woman's unblinking stare, every muscle in Lena's body screaming with tension. Mrs. Albright watched her for another long, agonizing moment, her expression unreadable. "See that you don't," she finally said, her voice dropping to a low, almost guttural tone that sent a fresh wave of fear through Lena. The Thorne family values discretion and loyalty above all else, and they have very little tolerance for those who do not respect their boundaries. You would do well to remember that, Ms. Petrova. Some secrets are best left undisturbed." With that final, chilling pronouncement, Mrs. Albright turned and walked out the heavy oak door, closing behind her with the same unnerving click it always did. Lena stood rooted to the spot, her legs trembling, her lungs burning as she slowly, cautiously released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and relief. She had been so close, so terrifyingly close to being caught. The thought of what Elias Thorne would do, if he found out about her snooping, about the diary, sent a cold spike of dread through her. She waited, listening intently for any sound of returning footsteps, for any hint that Mrs. Albright was still lurking outside the door. When only silence greeted her, Lena quickly, almost frantically, retrieved the diary from its hiding place. Her hands still shook, but a fierce determination now mingled with her fear. She had to read this, had to understand. She carefully tucked the old journal into the deep pocket of her apron, its weight a comforting yet terrifying presence against her hip. She needed a safe place, a private moment, to absorb its full contents. The library was no longer safe. She swiftly made her way out of the library, her steps light and hurried, the scent of old paper and dust clinging to her. Her mind was a dizzying kaleidoscope of cryptic words, of Aurora's lost smile, of Mrs. Albright's chilling warning. She had found something monumental, something that promised to unravel the very foundations of the Thorne family's carefully constructed silence. But before she could even reach the relative safety of her own small room, before she could truly delve into the forbidden words of the diary, a new, unexpected sound pierced the mansion's oppressive quiet. It came from Aurora's room, a floor above, a strange, disjointed noise she had never heard before. It was a mixture of agitated rustling, a frantic movement against fabric, and then, unmistakably, a sound almost like a stifled, muffled cry. That muffled cry, a sound both fragile and raw, tore through the mansion's carefully cultivated silence, ripping Lena from her reverie, from the cryptic words that still echoed in her mind. It was a sound that spoke of deep, unutterable pain, a primal distress she had never associated with the silent, ethereal Aurora. Without a second thought, the diary's heavy presence against her hip forgotten, Lena bolted. Her feet, usually light and careful, now hammered against the polished marble floor, a frantic rhythm that matched the frantic beating of her own heart. The grand staircase, usually traversed with measured grace, became a blur as she took the steps two at a time, her mind racing, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. What was happening? Had Mrs. Albright done something? Had Aurora somehow discovered the diary, or perhaps something even worse? The corridor leading to Aurora's room stretched before her, an opulent tunnel of shadows and hushed echoes. The cry didn't repeat, but a new sound now reached her ears, a rhythmic, almost frantic rustling, a soft thudding against fabric, like a bird trapped in a cage, desperate to escape. It was coming from behind Aurora's closed door. Lena reached it in a desperate rush, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold brass knob. She pushed it open with a soft click, her breath catching in her throat, the scent of old wood and something vaguely metallic like faint ozone before. A storm filling her nostrils. The scene that unfolded before her eyes was one of profound, disorienting distress. Aurora was not in her bed, nor was she at her vanity. Instead, she was huddled in a corner of the vast, exquisitely furnished room, tucked between a towering antique wardrobe and a velvet chaise lounge, a shadowy alcove she had somehow found. Her small frame was rocking back and forth, a slow, continuous motion that suggested an internal struggle of immense proportions. Her head was bowed, her usually immaculate dark hair now disheveled, partially obscuring her face. Her hands, clutched tightly against her chest, held something small and rectangular, something she seemed to be gazing at with an intense, unseeing focus. Lena's initial shock gave way to a wave of overwhelming concern, a profound empathy that transcended her role as a maid. Aurora was not just agitated. She was lost, utterly consumed by whatever torment had seized her. Lena moved slowly, deliberately, into the room, her eyes never leaving Aurora. She didn't want to startle her, didn't want to exacerbate whatever raw nerve had been struck. Each step was taken with the utmost care, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a silent, desperate energy, a stark contrast to the mansion's usual oppressive calm. As Lena drew closer, she could finally make out the object in Aurora's hands. It was an old photograph, its edges softened by time, its colors faded to sepia tones. Aurora's thumb was rubbing compulsively at the image, a small, repetitive gesture that spoke volumes of her distress. Lena knelt a few feet away, her heart aching with a pain that felt almost physical. From this vantage point, she could clearly see the photograph. It showed a younger Aurora, perhaps no older than 5 or 6, her face beaming with a genuine, unburdened smile, a smile Lena had only ever glimpsed in the stolen pages of a hidden diary. But she wasn't alone in the picture. Beside her, with an arm slung casually around her tiny shoulders, was another child, a boy, a few years older, with bright, mischievous eyes and a shock of sandy blonde hair. His smile mirrored Aurora's, wide and carefree. They were standing in what looked like a sun-dappled garden, surrounded by blossoming flowers, a picture of pure, unadulterated childhood joy. Aurora's eyes, fixed on that image, were wide and glazed, brimming with unshed tears that never quite fell. They held a deep, unbearable sorrow, a reflection of a memory too potent, too painful to contain. Lena understood instantly. This wasn't just a random tantrum or a sudden, inexplicable shift in Aurora's reclusive world. This was a crisis rooted in memory, a visual trigger that had ripped open an old wound, a wound that had festered in silence for years. The photograph, so innocent in its depiction of childhood happiness, was clearly the key, the specific moment or person that had plunged Aurora into this profound state of agitation. Lena's gaze lingered on the boy in the photo, a fleeting thought of his identity passing through her mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by the urgent need to alleviate Aurora's suffering. Hesitantly, Lena extended a hand, her movements slow and deliberate, her fingers hovering in the air between them. She didn't touch Aurora, not yet. She simply offered her presence, a silent anchor, in the storm that raged within the girl. "It's all right," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible, a soft murmur in the quiet room. "I'm here. You're not alone." The words were simple, yet they carried the full weight of Lena's genuine concern, her burgeoning affection for this broken young woman. She watched Aurora's face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that her words had pierced the veil of pain. There was none, only the relentless rocking, the glazed eyes fixed on the faded photograph. Lena knew then that words, for Aurora, might not be enough. She needed something more, something deeper, something that bypassed the logical mind and spoke directly to the heart. Her gaze inadvertently drifted to the diary, still tucked into her apron pocket, its presence a comforting weight. And then she remembered the melody, the notes she had seen scribbled on the margins of one of the diary entries, a simple, haunting tune that Aurora herself had apparently composed, or perhaps cherished. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but Lena had to try. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Lena began to hum. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound at first, a gentle murmur that filled the silence with a fragile hope. The melody was simple, repetitive, yet imbued with a profound sweetness, a childlike innocence that seemed to resonate with the image Aurora held. Lena kept her eyes on Aurora, watching for any reaction, any change in her tormented posture. The humming continued, a soothing, wordless lullaby, filling the vast, quiet room. Each note was delivered with a tender precision, a silent plea for connection, for release. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rocking began to falter. The rhythmic thudding against the fabric softened, then ceased altogether. Aurora's body, still tense, stilled. Her head remained bowed for a long moment, the dark curtain of her hair still obscuring her face, but the frantic energy that had consumed her seemed to lessen, replaced by a fragile stillness. Then, with agonizing slowness, Aurora's head lifted, her eyes, still wide and glistening with unspilled tears, still brimming with that profound sorrow, finally shifted from the photograph. They found Lena, locking on her face, with an intensity that sent a shiver down Lena's spine. It was a gaze that was both vulnerable and piercing, full of an ancient, inarticulate pain. Lena stopped humming, holding her breath, unwilling to break the delicate spell that had been cast. The silence stretched between them, thick and pregnant with unspoken emotion, broken only by the soft, ragged sound of Aurora's breathing. Aurora's hand, the one not clutching the photograph, slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to rise. It was a movement so deliberate, so tentative, that Lena felt her own heart pound in anticipation. The hand, slender and pale, trembled slightly as it moved. Through the air, traversing the small distance between them, Lena remained absolutely still, her own hand still hovering, her eyes locked with Aurora's. And then, with a feather-light touch, Aurora's fingers made contact with Lena's cheek. It was a touch so delicate, so impossibly soft, that for a moment Lena questioned if it had even happened. But it was real, a touch as light as a feather, yet it carried the undeniable weight of years of silence. The culmination of unspoken words, of unexpressed pain, of an entire life lived behind an impenetrable wall. It was an unexpected bridge, forged in a moment of shared vulnerability, between two worlds that had seemed utterly disparate. The warmth of Aurora's skin, the slight tremor in her touch, was a shock to Lena's system, a jolt of raw, profound connection. This was the first time Aurora had ever initiated physical contact, the first time she had reached out, truly reached out to another human being. It was monumental. A crack had formed in the carefully constructed facade, a tiny, fragile opening into the depths of Aurora's long-dormant soul. Lena felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, a mix of relief, sorrow, and fierce protectiveness. She wanted to weep, to hold Aurora close, to shield her from whatever ghosts haunted that photograph. But she remained still, recognizing the sacredness of the moment, the immense courage it must have taken for Aurora to make this connection. Her own hand, which had been hovering, now slowly, gently, covered Aurora's hand on her cheek, a soft acknowledgement, a silent promise. "It's all right," Lena whispered again, her voice thick with emotion, barely able to speak past the lump in her throat. "I'm here. You're not alone." The words hung in the air, a balm, a lifeline, a testament to the fragile, burgeoning bond between them. Aurora's eyes, still fixed on Lena's, seemed to soften, a flicker of something almost like understanding, or perhaps just a momentary respite from her pain, passing through their depths. The moment, so fragile, so deeply intimate, felt as if it stretched into an eternity, suspended outside the bounds of time. Then abruptly it shattered. A sudden, sharp sound from the doorway, the creak of an old hinge protesting against a forceful entry, ripped through the delicate atmosphere. Both Lena and Aurora flinched, their heads snapping towards the sound. Standing silhouetted in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, was Elias Thorne. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wide with an unreadable mixture of emotions. Shock was clearly there, a stark, almost disbelieving expression etched onto his handsome face. But beneath it, Lena saw something else, a flash of intense, burning rage, a fury that seemed to radiate from him, chilling the air. And then, fleetingly, something else entirely, something Lena couldn't quite identify, a flicker of vulnerability, or perhaps even a strange, bewildered pain, before his face hardened into one impenetrable mask. He had seen it all. He had seen Aurora's hand on Lena's face. The air in the room, already thick with unspoken grief and a nascent, fragile hope, became suddenly brittle, charged with a potent, dangerous energy. Elias Thorne filled the doorway, a menacing silhouette against the muted light of the hallway, his presence an immediate, suffocating weight. His eyes fixed on Lena's hand resting on Aurora's tear-streaked face, burned with an intensity that promised a storm. The controlled fury Lena had only glimpsed before now radiated from him. A palpable heat that seemed to warp the very oxygen around them. His jaw was clenched, a muscle, twitching violently beneath his taut skin, and his broad shoulders, usually so relaxed in their power, were stiff with a coiled tension. He took a step into the room, then another, his movements swift and predatory. "What have you done?" he growled, his voice a low, guttural rumble, laced with an anger so profound it made the small hairs on Lena's arms stand on end. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a furious declaration. "Get away from her." His hand shot out, not touching Lena, but hovering, a threatening gesture that made her instinctively recoil, even as she refused to break contact with Aurora. A protective instinct, fierce and primal, surged through her, hardening her resolve. She met Elias's burning gaze, her own eyes unwavering, a silent challenge passing between them. Aurora, still holding the worn photograph, felt the sudden tremor in Lena's hand, the subtle stiffening of her posture, and something shifted within her. Her fingers, which had been gently tracing Lena's cheek, now tightened, grasping Lena's hand with surprising strength, a desperate, almost painful grip. It was a silent plea, a fierce refusal to be separated, a desperate act of claiming. Elias, seeing the defiance in Lena's eyes and the unexpected possessiveness in Aurora's grip, let out a harsh, frustrated breath. He moved quickly then, his large hand closing around Lena's arm, his grip like steel. He didn't pull her roughly, not yet, but the implied force was unmistakable. He meant to separate them, to sever this burgeoning connection with a surgeon's cold precision. Lena gasped, not from pain, but from the sudden, sharp intrusion, the violation of the fragile peace they had just found. "Let go," Elias commanded, his voice now a low hiss, dangerous and uncompromising. "Now!" But Aurora's grip only intensified. Her small fingers, surprisingly strong, dug into Lena's palm, a silent anchor in the swirling chaos. Her wide, haunted eyes, which had been fixed on Lena's, flickered towards her father, a flash of something unreadable, fear, defiance, or perhaps a glimmer of understanding passing through them. It was the first truly active resistance Lena had ever witnessed from her, and it sent a jolt through her, a wave of profound recognition. This wasn't just a girl withdrawn into silence. This was a spirit fighting for its newfound connection. As Elias tried to gently but firmly pull Lena away, his grip tightening just enough to convey his intent without causing physical harm, Lena's gaze fell to the object Aurora still clutched in her other hand. It was the small, faded photograph, its edges softened by time and touch. Now, in the harsher light filtering from the hallway, Lena could finally make out the image with unsettling clarity. Two little girls, no older than 4 or 5, were captured in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. They were sitting on a swing set, their legs pumping high into the air, their faces thrown back in laughter, their hair a blur of motion. One girl had light, sun-kissed hair, just like Aurora's. The other, however, had dark, raven hair, precisely the same shade as Lena's own childhood locks. In her face, the small, cherubic face, caught mid-giggle, was undeniably, impossibly, her own. A cold, sickening wave washed over Lena, stealing the air from her lungs. Her heart slammed. Against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was an exact match. The same slightly crooked smile, the same wide, curious eyes, the same tiny dimple that appeared when she laughed too hard. It was her, a younger version of herself, playing with a girl who was unmistakably a younger Aurora. The swing set, too, felt eerily familiar, though she couldn't place it. A phantom ache of a memory just out of reach. A whisper, barely audible, escaped Lena's lips. That's me." Elias paused, his hand still on Lena's arm, his head tilting slightly as he followed her gaze to the photograph. His eyes, previously narrowed in anger, widened infinitesimally, a flicker of something, akin to confusion, then dawning horror, crossing his features. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, a terrifying implication. And then, as if to underscore the impossible connection, Aurora, still clutching Lena's hand in the photograph, began to hum. It was the same mournful, haunting melody Lena had heard from her diary earlier, a tune that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. But this time it resonated with a different, far more personal echo within Lena's own mind. A forgotten chord struck deep in her memory, stirring something ancient and deeply buried. Flashbacks, fragmented and hazy, flickered behind her eyes. A shadowy nursery, the scent of talcum powder and lavender, the gentle rocking of a cradle, a soft melodic voice singing that very tune, a lullaby whispered into the quiet darkness. It was her mother's voice. Or no, not quite. It was a woman's voice, yes, but one she couldn't quite place, a memory that had been locked away, a song she hadn't heard, hadn't thought of in decades. But the melody itself, simple and melancholic, was undeniably the same. This melody, Lena whispered, her voice hoarse with a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread and wonder. She turned her gaze to Aurora, whose eyes were still fixed on her, shimmering with unshed tears. "What do you know it from?" Aurora didn't answer with words, of course. She simply squeezed Lena's hand again, a silent affirmation, a profound connection. But the question, once uttered, seemed to break something in the air, a dam holding back a torrent of unspoken truths. Suddenly, Aurora released Lena's hand, her movements abrupt and purposeful. She reached for a small notepad and a pencil resting on her bedside table, her fingers trembling with a newfound urgency. Elias, still rooted to the spot, his face a mask of bewildered horror, watched paralyzed. Lena, too, could only stare, her heart thrumming a frantic beat against her ribs, a cold premonition. Zettlingen hier gut. The pencil, held awkwardly in Aurora's unsteady hand, scratched against the paper, a soft, insistent sound in the heavy silence. She didn't hesitate, didn't plan. It was as if a dam had burst within her, releasing a flood of suppressed images and emotions onto the page. Her hand moved with a frantic, almost desperate energy, drawing lines and shapes with a speed that defied her years of apparent disengagement. Lena leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat, trying to decipher the emerging images. First, two tiny figures, recognizable as the girls from the photograph, appeared on the page. They were playing, laughing, innocent and carefree. A swing set, a garden, sunshine, a scene of idyllic childhood. Lena could almost hear their childish giggles, feel the warmth of the sun on their skin. Then, the lines grew darker, more chaotic. The scene shifted, grew distorted. One of the figures, the dark-haired girl, Lena's younger self, was no longer on the swing. She was in midair, a small, helpless form tumbling downwards. A fall, an accident. The lines conveyed a sudden, horrifying motion, a violent disruption of play. Lena gasped a small, choke sound. She could feel the echo of that fall in her own body, a phantom jolt, a forgotten terror. She remembered a scar on her knee, a story her parents had told her about a Childhood tumble, a bad fall from a tree, but the details had always been vague, brushed aside. Now, she felt a sickening certainty that this was not a tree. This was something else entirely. The pencil continued its furious dance, adding more details. Two larger figures emerged in the background, shadowy and indistinct at first, then gaining chilling clarity. Two men, one his face, drawn with sharp, familiar lines, had a shock of dark hair. Lena recognized him instantly. It was her father, younger, more vibrant, but unmistakably him, his expression one of alarm, or perhaps something darker, more complex. He wasn't rushing forward, not helping, but standing observing. Then, the second figure, tall, imposing, with broad shoulders and a stern, unyielding profile. His face, though rendered in hurried, trembling strokes, was chillingly familiar. It was Elias Thorne. Younger, yes, but undeniably him. He, too, was not moving, not intervening, but watching. A silent, unblinking observer to the unfolding tragedy. It wasn't just an image. It was a silent scream, a confession in uncertain strokes, linking their pasts. In a brutal and unexpected way. The drawing was raw, visceral, a horrifying glimpse into a shared trauma, a pivotal moment that had seemingly bound their lives together in a tapestry of silence and deceit. Lena's blood ran cold. The fall, her father, Elias. The lullaby, the photograph. It was all converging, rushing towards her with the force of a tidal wave. The truth, long buried beneath years of convenient amnesia and unspoken secrets, was beginning to unfurl piece by agonizing piece. A profound, predestined connection, forged in the crucible of a childhood accident, shadowed by the complicit silence of the men in their lives. The horror of it, the sheer betrayal, threatened to overwhelm her. Elias Thorne, who had been watching Aurora's hand with growing apprehension, felt the air leave, his lungs in a ragged gasp as the final strokes of the drawing solidified. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were wide with a stark, disbelieving terror. His face, moments ago flushed with fury, drained of all color, becoming ashen, cadaverous. The rage that had burned so fiercely within him was extinguished, replaced by a cold, numbing shock. He stared at the drawing, then at Aurora, then at Lena, his gaze frantic, trapped. The composure that defined him, the impenetrable mask he wore for the world, shattered, revealing a man utterly undone. He swayed slightly, his hand involuntarily reaching out for the wall, as if to steady himself against an invisible blow. At that exact moment, the heavy oak door creaked open further, revealing the elegant, silver-haired figure of Mrs. Albright. She had evidently been drawn by the rising tension, perhaps by Elias's raised voice. She stepped into the room, her eyes taking in the scene. Elias, pale and trembling. Lena, frozen in a state of horrified realization. And Aurora, her small hand still clutching the pencil. Her eyes fixed on the devastating image she had just brought to life. Mrs. Albright's gaze, sharp and perceptive, fell upon the drawing, then drifted to the photograph still clutched in Aurora's other hand, and finally to Lena's face, which mirrored the young girl in the faded image. A gasp escaped. The housekeeper's lips, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening with a sudden, profound understanding, a terrible recognition. The air in the room became impossibly dense, suffocating, saturated with the chilling, undeniable truth that had at last been exposed. The air in the room became impossibly dense, suffocating, saturated with the chilling, undeniable truth that had at last been exposed. Mrs. Albright's eyes, usually so composed, now shimmered with a mixture of grief and a fierce, long-suppressed anger. Her gaze settled on Elias Thorne, a silent, damning accusation. He flinched, visibly, as if struck, his already pale face blanching further. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged, only a dry, rasping breath. The silence stretched taut and agonizing, broken only by Aurora's shallow, rapid breathing and the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand, still clutching the pencil. Lena felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a primal fear that resonated with a distant, half-forgotten memory. She looked from Mrs. Albright's pain-filled face to Elias's shattered one, then down at the drawing, the vibrant, terrifying red splash against the innocent green grass, the two small figures, one falling, the other reaching out. The photograph, still clutched in Aurora's other hand, depicted a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a stark contrast to the horror now laid bare. It was as if two distinct timelines had violently collided in this opulent, suffocating room. Her own heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of approaching revelation, and suddenly, the room felt too small, the air too thin. A phantom chill touched her skin, raising goosebumps on her arms, and a faint, metallic taste bloomed on her tongue, an echo of a sensation she couldn't place, yet felt deeply. Mrs. Albright took a hesitant step forward, her eyes never leaving Elias. Her voice, when it came, was a low, guttural murmur, laced with a pain that seemed to carve itself directly from her soul. He hid everything, she accused, her words cutting through the heavy air like shards of glass. To protect the fortune, to protect himself. But Aurora never recovered. And you were the other child. The last words were directed at Lena, a whispered confession that ripped through the fabric of her carefully constructed present, tearing it away to reveal a past she had unknowingly buried. Lena gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound, her mind reeling, trying desperately to reconcile the woman she was with the other child Mrs. Albright spoke of. The pieces began to fall into place, not gently, but with brutal, bone-jarring force. The strange familiarity of the house, the unnerving pull toward Aurora, the fragments of memory that had haunted her since her arrival. It wasn't just a job, it was destiny, a cruel twist of fate that had brought her back to the very place where her own life and Aurora's had been irrevocably altered. Elias Thorne finally found his voice a raw, desperate croak. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. Slowly, repeatedly, a frantic denial against an undeniable truth. "No, you don't understand. It wasn't like that. It wasn't. I had to." His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a loophole, anything to reclaim the control that had so spectacularly abandoned him. But there was no escape. Now, the drawing, the photograph, the weight of Mrs. Albright's gaze, and Lena's dawning, horrified understanding, had cornered him, stripped him bare. The powerful billionaire, the man, who commanded empires with a flick of his wrist, was reduced to a frightened, cornered animal. He stumbled backward, colliding with a heavy armchair, slumping into its plush depths, his face buried. In his hands, a low, guttural sound, something between a sob and a strangled cry, escaped him, shaking his entire frame. Mrs. Albright's voice hardened, gaining strength with each word, as if years of bottled-up truth were finally erupting. "It was a summer afternoon," she began, her gaze fixed on Lena, "almost 20 years ago. Aurora was just 5, full of life, always laughing. Your father, Lena, he was the groundskeeper here then, and you were Aurora's best friend. Inseparable, the two of you, always exploring, always finding new adventures in the gardens." Lena felt a jolt, a flash of something in her mind, a little girl with bright, inquisitive eyes, chasing butterflies through rows, bushes, her own laughter mingling with another's, a sense of boundless freedom. It was a ghost of a memory, ethereal and fleeting, but undeniably there. The puzzle pieces weren't just falling. They were locking into place with a sickening click. They were playing near the old fountain. Mrs. Albright continued, her voice thick with emotion. "The one with the stone angels. Aurora, being Aurora, always so adventurous, climbed onto the edge, trying to reach a bird's nest. You try to stop her, Lena. You always did. You were always the careful one. Lena's breath hitched. She remembered. A flash of a stone angel, cold and weathered. Beneath her small fingers, the frantic warning she tried to shout, the desperate lunge of her small body. But she slipped. Mrs. Albright's voice dropped to a near whisper, and she fell. Hard. Her head hit the edge of the fountain. There was so much blood. And then the silence. Her laughter. Gone. Just silence. A wave of nausea washed over Lena, the memory of the red, the silence, the sheer, paralyzing terror of that moment, crashing over her with a force that stole her breath. She could almost feel the rough stone, the chill of the water, the terrifying stillness of Aurora's small body. Your father, Mrs. Albright's gaze shifted to Elias, now slumped and broken in the armchair. He was the first on the scene. He scooped Aurora up, ran her inside, tried to stop the bleeding. He called the ambulance. He did everything he could. Her voice was a fierce defense, a testament to a man unjustly maligned. But Mr. Thorne, when he arrived, saw his daughter unconscious, heard the whispers, the potential for scandal, for his reputation to be tarnished. He saw an opportunity to control the narrative. Elias Thorne flinched again, his body convulsing slightly. The truth, stripped bare, was a torment he could no longer escape. The words hung in the air, a devastating tapestry woven from lies and manipulation, a tapestry that had defined Lena's entire life. Her father, the kind, gentle man who had always carried a quiet sadness in his eyes, who had worked tirelessly, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, to provide for them, had been a scapegoat. The anger that surged through Lena was a living, breathing entity, hot and raw, burning away years of suppressed confusion and hurt. She looked at Elias Thorne, not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. He had stolen her childhood, stolen her best friend, stolen her father's good name, and had condemned Aurora to a silent, isolated existence, all for the sake of his own pride and fortune. The injustice of it all was a crushing weight. Elias Thorne finally lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot, fixed on Lena. His voice was barely a whisper, ragged with despair. I only wanted to protect her, he rasped his gaze, flickering to Aurora, who remained still, her eyes now glued to the exchange, a strange, almost lucid intensity in their depths. After the fall, she changed. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't laugh. The doctor said it was trauma, that she might never recover. I was terrified. I thought if anyone knew the truth, if anyone found out my daughter was broken, that everything I had built, everything I had fought for would crumble. The reputation, the business, her future. I panicked. I just wanted to make it go away. To protect her from any more pain, from any more scrutiny. His words were heavy with the weight of years of silent guilt, each syllable a confession of a fear that had consumed him, twisting him into the ruthless man he had become. I ruined everything, he finished, his voice breaking, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. I thought I was protecting her, protecting us. But I only made it worse. He was a shell of the man he usually presented to the world, exposed, vulnerable, and utterly shattered. Lena looked at Aurora, whose small, pale face now held an expression she had never seen before. A flicker of recognition, a profound sadness, and something else, something akin to understanding. The young girl's eyes, usually distant and unfocused, now held Lena's gaze with an unnerving clarity, a silent plea. Lena's anger, though still simmering, began to soften, transmuted by a powerful wave of compassion. She knelt beside Aurora, taking the small, trembling hand that still clutched the pencil, gently easing it free. She then took Aurora's other hand, the one that had held the faded photograph, and squeezed it, a silent promise. "I remember," Lena whispered, her voice thick with emotion, the words a bridge across 2 decades of silence and separation. "I remember. You." Aurora's grip on Lena's hand tightened, a fragile but firm response. Her fingers intertwined with Lena's, a gesture so simple, yet so profound, it stole Lena's breath. A single tear, the first Lena had ever seen, tracked a glistening path down Aurora's cheek, not a tear of fear or pain, but of something else entirely, perhaps release, perhaps sorrow, perhaps a dawning hope. Her eyes, still fixed on Lena's, seemed to shimmer, reflecting a glimmer of a presence that had been absent for so long. It was as if, after all these years, a tiny sliver of the girl Aurora once was had finally surfaced. Reaching out from the depths of her trauma, Lena felt the connection, deep and undeniable, the invisible thread that had always bound them, now finally visible, tangible. The truth was out, ugly and painful, but it was also a cleansing fire, burning away the lies, clearing a path for something new, something real. Elias Thorne, broken and defeated, sat slumped in the armchair, his empire of deceit crumbling around him. But Aurora, still silent, still fragile, was looking at Lena with an intensity that spoke more than 1,000 words, a desperate, hopeful plea. And in that moment, Lena knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her work here, her true purpose, had only just begun. The atmosphere in the grand, echoing foyer of the Thorne mansion remained thick with the aftermath of revelation. Elias Thorne, his face a mask of profound defeat, seemed to shrink within himself, the formidable titan of industry reduced to a broken old man. He watched as Lena, her own eyes still glistening with unshed tears, gently guided Aurora back towards the quiet sanctuary of her room, the photograph still clutched between their intertwined hands. The silence that followed their departure was heavy, suffocating, punctuated only by Elias's ragged breathing. For days, he moved through the mansion like a ghost, his once impeccable suits hanging loose on his frame, his gaze distant, lost in a labyrinth of guilt and regret. The empire he had meticulously built now felt hollow, its foundations corroded by the very secrets he had guarded so fiercely. But something had shifted. The truth, however brutal, had also brought a strange, unsettling clarity. Elias, for the first time in decades, began to look beyond himself, beyond his carefully constructed facade of control. He started small, almost imperceptibly. He dismissed the stern-faced security detail that had always shadowed Aurora, replacing them with a single, gentle caregiver who understood the delicate dance of trauma and healing. He ordered the heavy, ornate furniture in Aurora's wing to be replaced with softer, more inviting pieces, brighter colors, and textures that invited touch rather than glass that repelled it. He even had a small, private garden planted outside Aurora's window, filled with the fragrant lavender and delicate roses Lena had mentioned. Aurora once loved, a desperate, silent plea for forgiveness rooted in the earth. His once authoritative voice softened, becoming hesitant, almost pleading whenever he addressed Lena. He sought her out not with demands, but with quiet, searching questions about Aurora, about her preferences, her comfort. He was a man trying to learn a language he had forgotten, a father attempting to reconnect with a daughter he had effectively lost to his own cruel choices. One afternoon, Lena found him in the vast, almost unused library, surrounded by dusty tomes on child psychology and grief counseling, his reading glasses perched precariously on his nose. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, a weariness etched onto his features that no amount of wealth could erase. He cleared his throat, his voice raspy, a stark contrast to the booming tone she had once associated with him. "Lena," he began, the name feeling unfamiliar on his tongue, stripped of its former employer-employee context. I have made arrangements. For Aurora. For her future. For anything she might need. And for you. Whatever you wish, Lena. A new life. Anything. He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, clasped tightly on his lap. You brought back my daughter. The daughter I thought was gone forever. I can never thank you enough. His voice was barely a whisper on the last words, thick with a gratitude so profound it bordered on despair, a desperate plea. For a redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. Lena simply nodded, her gaze soft, understanding the immense weight behind his words. It wasn't about money or favors anymore. It was about the fragile flicker of hope that Lena had rekindled in his desolate world. With Elias slowly, painfully stepping back and allowing genuine healing to begin, the mansion, Thorn, once a mausoleum of secrets, began its slow, arduous transformation. The air, once heavy with unspoken sorrow, now hummed with a delicate, nascent energy. Lena was no longer merely an employee, a hired hand navigating the labyrinthine corridors. She was a constant, gentle presence, a steady anchor in Aurora's tumultuous sea of fractured memories. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, evolving beyond caregiver and patient, beyond even friend. It was a bond forged in shared pain and resurrected affection, the profound, resonant connection of two sisters reunited. Against all odds, they spent hours together, nestled in Aurora's sunlit room, or wandering through the newly manicured gardens. Lena, always attuned to Aurora's subtle cues, her nonverbal language of discomfort, curiosity, or fleeting joy. Lena understood that direct interrogation was futile, even harmful. Instead, she became a conduit for Aurora's inner world, a patient guide through the landscape of her forgotten past. She introduced art, not as therapy, but as play. They painted together, Lena guiding Aurora's stiff fingers to swirl vibrant blues and greens on a canvas, creating abstract explosions of color that seemed to mirror the chaos and beauty within Aurora's own mind. Aurora would sometimes stare at the swirling patterns, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through her hands, a spark of recognition in her eyes. Lena played soft, melancholic melodies on a portable music player, often traditional folk songs, their simple tunes resonating with a primeval beauty. She watched Aurora's face, searching for any ripple of emotion, any flicker of memory, stirred by the notes. One afternoon, Lena played a lullaby, a sweet, soaring tune that Lena vaguely remembered from her own early childhood, a melody that Elias had confirmed was one of Aurora's favorites before the accident. As the notes filled the room, Aurora's eyes, usually distant, focused with an intensity that made Lena's breath catch. A tiny, almost imperceptible hum escaped Aurora's lips, a sound so fragile, so unexpected, that Lena almost missed it. It was a faint, wavering echo of the melody, a sound that died almost as soon as it began, but it was there. A sound that hadn't been heard from Aurora in years. Lena didn't react overtly, didn't break the delicate spell, but a wave of profound hope washed over her, a silent prayer of gratitude. The progress was excruciatingly slow, measured in increments so small they would have been invisible to anyone else. A slight turn of the head towards a sound, a fleeting glance held for a fraction of a second longer, a hand reaching out to touch Lena's arm, not in distress, but in what seemed like a rudimentary gesture of connection. Lena celebrated each tiny victory in her heart, knowing the immense effort each one represented for Aurora. She would describe familiar objects, places, and people from their shared childhood, painting vivid pictures with her words, never pressuring, simply offering, planting seeds of memory in the barren landscape of Aurora's mind. She told stories, not just of their own past, but simple, comforting tales, reading aloud from children's books, her voice a soothing balm. Aurora, who had once recoiled from any sustained human interaction, now leaned into Lena's presence, her head sometimes resting gently on Lena's shoulder as Lena read, a quiet trust blooming between them. The mansion, once a place of oppressive solitude, began to soften. The sterile silence was gradually replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the garden, the distant hum of Lena's music, and most miraculously, the occasional soft, almost inaudible sounds from Aurora herself. Lena found herself, more and more often, observing Aurora with a quiet joy, watching as a faint, elusive smile would sometimes touch the corners of Aurora's lips when Lena told a particularly silly story, or when a friendly squirrel darted across the garden path outside her window. These were not the vacant, unsettling smiles of the past, but true, nascent expressions of genuine amusement, fleeting glimpses of the vibrant spirit that had been buried for so long. Then came the day that changed everything once more. They were in Aurora's room, Lena showing her a collection of old photographs Elias had reluctantly provided, faded images of a life before the trauma. Among them was a picture of Lena and Aurora as small children, tangled in a messy embrace on a swing set, their faces smeared with mud, laughing freely. Lena pointed to her own smiling face, then to Aurora's, recounting the memory of that joyful, muddy afternoon. "That was us," Lena whispered, her voice full of tenderness. "Best friends, always." Aurora's gaze lingered on the photograph, her fingers tracing the outlines of her younger self. Her breath hitched, a small, fragile sound that drew Lena's full attention. Then, slowly, painfully, her lips parted. The sound was so faint, so delicate, it was almost imperceptible, a mere breath of air against the vast silence of the room. But it was there, a single, whispered syllable, carrying the weight of years, the echo of a lost identity, the first word Aurora Thorne had spoken in over 2 decades. Lena. The name hung in the air, a shimmering, impossible miracle. Lena froze, her heart leaping into her throat, tears stinging her eyes. She didn't move, didn't speak, terrified of breaking the spell, of shattering this fragile moment of breakthrough. Aurora's eyes, wide and luminous, were fixed on Lena's face, a profound recognition shining within them, a consciousness that had been painstakingly resurrected. Lena reached out, her hand trembling as she gently cupped Aurora's cheek. "Aurora," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion, confirming the reality of the moment, the sacred truth of that spoken name. A few weeks later, Lena was sitting in the renovated solarium, a bright, airy space that now served as Aurora's favorite spot, filled with thriving plants and soft cushions. Elias Thorne entered, his steps more confident now, though his face still carried the marks of his painful journey. He watched Aurora, who was humming softly to herself, a tuneless but melodic sound, as she meticulously arranged a small bouquet of freshly picked lavender. He cleared his throat, drawing Lena's attention. "She's different," he said, his voice laced with awe, a father witnessing a rebirth he had believed impossible. "She's coming back." He looked at Lena, his gaze full of and profound, unspoken gratitude. "You brought back my daughter, Lena. You gave her back to herself. I can never thank you enough for what you have done. No amount of money, no apology, can ever repay it." He meant it. Every word was imbued with a raw, honest regret and an overwhelming sense of relief. Lena smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She observed Aurora, who for the first time in years was truly smiling back at her, a soft, shy upturn of her lips that spoke volumes. The smile wasn't forced or vacant. It was real, a nascent expression of inner peace, a reflection of the light Lena had brought back in her life. In that quiet moment, Lena's mind drifted, reflecting on the arduous journey, the pain, the truth that had shattered one world only to build another. She thought Some silences can only be broken by the echo of a shared past and by the courage to love. Again, it wasn't just Aurora who had found her voice. Lena, too, had found her purpose, her true calling, intertwined with the destiny of the girl she had known as a child. The mansion Thorn, once a monument to a wealthy man's isolation and a daughter's silent suffering, was now slowly, beautifully transforming into a true home. It was a place of healing, a sanctuary where the echoes of past trauma were gradually being replaced by the soft cadences of hope and connection. The vast, empty rooms began to feel lived in, infused with the warmth of genuine human interaction, the gentle sounds of life slowly returning. Elias, still on his path of atonement, dedicated himself to supporting Aurora's recovery in every way possible, learning to be a father again, not just a provider. Lena, no longer an outsider, but an integral part of this nascent family, found solace and fulfillment in her rediscovered bond with Aurora. The future was still uncertain, the path to full recovery long and arduous, but the crushing weight of the past had finally begun to lift. The truth, once a devastating burden, had proven to be the very key to their freedom. The gentle, almost ethereal sound of Aurora humming the melody of their shared childhood lullaby drifted through the now sun-drenched halls of the mansion, a sound that just weeks ago would have been an unimaginable fantasy. It was a soft, tuneful murmur, a testament to a spirit slowly reawakening, a melody woven from memories finally resurfacing. Lena watched her, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She knew the journey ahead would be long, filled with its own challenges and moments of struggle. But as Aurora's soft, pure notes filled the air, Lena smiled. She smiled because the profound, suffocating darkness that had enveloped the Thorn Mansion for so long had at last truly begun to yield, giving way to the soft, gentle, and utterly transformative light of a new dawn.